And welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based. Dr. Ash, how are you today?
I'm so well. How are you?
I'm very well. Now, what have you been up to since the last podcast?
Oh, I have just spent 10 days in the beautiful southwest of Western Australia and spent lots of time at the beach, lots of relaxation.
And a bit of showing off there. Maybe enough of that now.
What about you? What have you been up to?
I have been up to many events of eating. I'm very much a foodie. I love eating. I love exploring different places where I can eat. It does mean I need to exercise. And here in Perth in Australia, it's quite hot. So if you need to exercise, it's 5 a.m. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been really nice. I think we're really lucky to be living in this end of the world where the weather is incredible. So sorry to all of you guys in the Northern Hemisphere. It's literally blue skies.
It is, and hot.
And hot. So beach weather's great. And so far, all things COVID-19 are very much under control here. So the life is quite normal.
We are very fortunate.
We are very fortunate. But we have the great privilege here of being able to be in a space where we can talk to world experts in areas that can really affect our practice. And I've just gone back to work and working with the lovely families that I get to see every single day. And it's incredible how in your conversation with people, you can talk about what's the latest research and this is why we're doing it.
Yeah, which leads us into what we're going to talk about today, which is an article recently published in Physiology and Behaviour. The article is titled Patterns and Reliability of Children's Skin Temperature Prior to and During Sleep in the Home Setting. And we're lucky enough to talk to the lead author on this paper, Dr. Sue McCabe, today, who is an occupational therapist and a clinical researcher. Sue has a wealth of experience and we've worked with her a lot over the years and know firsthand how much she truly values the holistic team approach. She's someone who truly cares and is skilled at taking a step back to see that bigger picture. For years, we've talked about this research and we always walk away with new evidence-based ideas that can be implemented into practice. And we know that you'll all really benefit from listening to this conversation with Sue today.
Can't wait for this one.
So the reason we want to talk about this article today is because sleep is really important to everyone. We know what it's like to not sleep well and the impact that this can have on how you actually function the next day or even in the week that follows a bout of poor sleep. We're increasingly aware of sleep difficulties in children with cerebral palsy and obviously the overflow effect that can have for parents, carers and the whole family really. And we found this article really interesting because it helps us think about the physiology of sleep and the really important role that temperature plays in this. So, Dana, I'm going to throw over to you to sum up the main features of this study.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ash. That was a great introduction. I wish I was Sue with that kind of introduction. It's a beautiful one. So if we're going through the PICO and we want to review, the participants, the intervention, the comparison, the outcome, this one's a really interesting one because it's really aimed in terms of the participants of children, school-aged children aged between 6 and 12, typically developing. There were 22 participants in this study. And what they really wanted to look at, the authors were wanting to find out the patterns of temperature through the nights during specific times and seeing the reliability of that across the 4 days. And they used measures such as actigraphy as well as using temperature measures using eye buttons, very flash, as well as some questionnaires as well, using the Children's Sleep Habits Questionnaire. So with all of these measures, the outcomes are very interesting. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the abstract, which I think really sums it up perfectly. There were evident patterns of skin temperature change during and before sleep. In particular, the distal temperature was lower but rose more rapidly than the proximal temperature after reported bedtime and prior to sleep onset. So this reflected a timely rise in the DPG, which is the, what's that again? How do we define that? DPG, D was the distal
proximal gradient.
Thank you. And shows that the distal vasodilation precedes sleep onset in school-aged children. So the measures of skin temperature and sleep were really practical for children in their home settings, and the observed patterns were consistent across consecutive school nights. So the environmental and behavioural strategies that manage skin temperature during and before sleep should be explored for their potential as valuable components of treatment in child insomnia.
Can I just say, I learned so much from this paper.
Oh my goodness.
Sleep is not my area of expertise by any stretch.
Agreed.
And
this is amazing.
Yeah, I feel very informed after reading that. So thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if we could start off by explaining this really important concept of the distal-proximal gradient.
Yeah, sure.
It's quite a key concept that kind of flows through the paper. So could you explain it to us a little bit more?
Sure. And that was a big discovery for me. So in my research, I didn't know a thing about skin temperatures or distal proximal gradients at all. When I started my PhD studies, I knew that people with cerebral palsy and other neurodevelopmental difficulties often reported that they had trouble managing their skin temperature during sleep. Parents would say they seemed uncomfortable, they seemed hot and sweaty, but then their feet were freezing. Was that good or bad? No one I knew seemed to be able to tell me, was it good or bad? How do we know? What can we tell? So that was kind of the questions behind my research focus into temperature and the impact on sleep. And it was pretty exciting for me to discover this whole world of skin temperatures and distal proximal gradient. And the fact that we need to have warm extremities, so our distal skin temperature, hands and feet, need to be warm before we can fall asleep. And it's really interesting that studies have been done across so many other populations, from premature babies, neonates, elderly, middle-aged people, people with dementia, a whole range of populations, but no one had looked at that with school-aged children. And yet we know that sleep and sleep onset difficulties can have a massive impact on every aspect of function for any child, or any age actually, but school-aged children in particular.
Yeah, I found that I actually made a note that, it's bizarre that all of these populations, there's such a wealth of information, but for some reason this big gap in
There was a big gap.
School-aged children. Yeah. And I just know anecdotally, all the times I've had trouble falling asleep, my feet have been really cold. So.
and that's kind of what's quite exciting actually, because when I first started doing this, it was really my supervisors guiding me who said, look, before you start looking at an intervention and at a trial of what's going to make a difference, we need to know what normative data are and what's out there and what's happening for children, typically developing children, what's going on. We can't make assumptions of what typically happens. And it was really exciting. At first I resisted that, I think. I thought, this is just kind of not my OT stuff. This is kind of very fundamental physiology. This doesn't feel like OT for me. But in fact, it was such an exciting discovery to realise that something as fundamental as needing warm hands and feet to fall asleep is just such a big part of sleep onset. And when I start thinking about the populations that this could be relevant for and the environments, the settings, the activities, the behaviours that are affected by this, it just suddenly turned into exactly the kind of thing that we as clinicians know matter: the person, their environment, their activities. So I don't know if I've explained it clearly. I haven't focused enough on that distal proximal gradient.
It'd be great to talk about it actually.
Yeah.
Let's describe that a little bit more.
So a bit more.
What it is.
So basically what other researchers have shown, and what this study showed as well, is that we have very distinct patterns of body temperature change across our whole 24 hours. So we have circadian rhythms, we have biological rhythms. And what I also was very excited to discover and realise is how important, it's not just sleep that matters actually for our health or well-being and participation, but it is those whole biological rhythms. And the rhythms of skin temperature change are part of that. They're affected by our environment, our activities, our health conditions, but they also affect what we do and how we do it. They affect how well we fall asleep. So during the day, our core body temperature is relatively higher, and as night approaches, as light dims, as we get relaxed and ready for sleep, with dim light, our melatonin levels rise and our core body temperature starts to drop. We used to think that was the drop in core body temperature that was fundamental to sleep onset. But what I've learned by this research and by reading other researchers is that, in fact, the mechanism that precipitates the drop in core body temperature is this change in the distal proximal gradient. So our proximal skin temperature starts to rise as we get closer to sleep onset, but our distal skin temperature, which is considerably lower in the hours before sleep, rises more rapidly. So it's the gradient of change, it's the rate of change in that gradient between distal and proximal that seems to be a fundamental mechanism that we can see as a measure of readiness for sleep.
This could be a silly question, but is it a matter of the blood travelling from the more proximal areas of the body to the more distal areas of the body, and that's why they start to warm up? And the core cools down?
I'm really glad you asked that, because I would have missed that whole point. But in fact, it's exactly that. The whole thing about that is it's around distal vasoconstriction and distal vasodilation. So when our extremities are warm, there's these little tiny, they're called arteriovenous anastomoses. They're smaller than capillaries and arteries, and they expand when we're warm. They constrict when we're cold, our extremities. And that's how we lose or hold our body temperature. So it's very much around our vascular function.
So interesting.
Yeah, it is.
And so is that really linked to, were you talking about the circadian rhythms? What are some of the other features that precipitate sleep? Because I know we're talking a lot about, I know there's a lot, but we're talking firstly about temperature, and you mentioned circadian rhythms and sort of briefly mentioned environment. Can you sort of talk a little bit more about that as well?
Sure. Look, it's the most amazing, gorgeous synchrony, really, like a symphony of things that all happen, and they need to happen in synchrony, and they all affect each other. So if you're drawing arrows of how things affect each other, it's all everything affects. So as we get dim light, so a lowering, it's all to do with the regulation centres in our brain, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which is just behind, near the pineal gland, behind the eye. We know that sleep and wake is significantly affected by changes in light. Bright light has a real strong effect on the rhythms of our body clock, and then dim light is what we need for our brain to start producing melatonin. So there's a real strong relationship between light and changes in body temperature. Okay. There's even changes in posture. So just lying down, like you know that when you're on a plane and you're really tired, there's this absolute ache to just lie flat.
Yes.
So changes in posture will change our blood pressure, and that will also send signals to our brain and change our vascular function, and it will play into that whole symphony of body changes.
That makes more sense now. This is why I can't sleep on the plane.
Yes, yeah, because we do
why
need
screen time is so, why the messaging around screen time
screen
is
time,
so,
yeah.
Yes.
And then even things as subtle as whether your eyes are opened or closed can make a difference to your distal temperature and the changes in your distal temperature. So another interesting little thing is someone's having difficulty falling asleep. They might be in the dark, but just actually physically closing your eyes is another physiological cue that's part of that whole pattern. And that's really relevant, I feel, for us as clinicians when we're working with children perhaps who have communication difficulties. We might say, look, just go to sleep. But we need to be able to say, lie down, put your head on the pillow, close your eyes.
Yeah, and establish those cues.
Yeah. And that's all part of it. We're not talking about temperature here, but in fact it's all part of that whole beautiful symphony of how everything affects everything else. Yeah.
So even just, I know, being on the iPad, I mean, we often hear that, isn't it? It's like, oh, that's how they relax and calm down. You go on the iPad and you might fall asleep that way perhaps. But, what are your thoughts on that then? Because that's another form of light.
It is. Look, I feel like this could be a whole other podcast. In theory, we know that any kind of light is going to suppress our production of melatonin. So therefore, people will generally say try to avoid the use of screens in the hour before bedtime. But equally, we know that there are many people, particularly people with conditions like autism, where use of that iPad as a communication device, as a calming strategy is fundamental. And if we were to say to families, just stop, we would create so much stress that it would be absolutely counterproductive. But there are apps that you can get on your devices that help block the blue light that's being emitted from the screens and instead
I've seen
so that can
function.
help mitigate the effects of the blue light. There's even, most of our devices now, the light on the screens can be automatically made dimmer as light progresses, so they can be less bright. As parents, hopefully we'd have some say on what the content is that the children are using. So we know that even things like changes in the content, so if it's music that's calm and rhythmical, slow and steady, is going to have a more sleep-inducing effect, whereas music that's arrhythmical or sounds or noises that are short and sharp and unpredictable, that's going to change as well. So I would always provide parents with information about the science of sleep and light and devices, but at the same time I would always explore ways that knowing that you can't just say these are the rules
One
and that's
size
the only
fits
thing.
all. Yeah,
It's just not going to work. So there's lots of ways to make it work and make it happen. Yep. And equally, some I've worked with, say, old teenagers, for example, who for various reasons have to get into bed at, say, 8:30. Maybe they're just in lots of pain and they just can't sit up in their chair any longer, into bed at 8:30. But we don't want them to fall asleep at 8:30, otherwise they'll be awake at 2:30 in the morning ready to start the day, 3:30 or 4:30. So it might be really reasonable and practical that they might have watched their Netflix or DVDs while they're lying in bed. So therefore we would work to say, okay, how can we make a real point of difference between being awake in bed and participating in wakeful activities, and then how can you kind of send yourself and your body a message that says, okay, now that's off and it's time to sleep. So it's a matter of being really practical and being really individualising, looking at the whole picture of what's working for people.
See, that's what we said at the beginning, wasn't it? Holistic picture. That's
absolutely.
That's definitely the case.
Yep.
So you're really talking a whole lot about cues, the different cues that precipitate sleep. Now, what I really loved in your papers is how you did try to control for obviously variances in temperature. We were just talking about how beautiful it is to be in Perth and it's hot and it's really light and, everything's a little bit different.
All the anti-sleep.
All of those things. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because when we're talking about temperature regulation and, air conditioning in summertime or in winter when it's really cold anyway, the practicalities of that.
Yep, sure. Oh, so once again, we could do hours. So there's a few points here. So one is when I think about our beautiful sunlight, we are so lucky. And one of the things so there's a few really important points that could apply to every, how I'm saying one size doesn't fit all, but there are a couple of points that you could say apply to everyone. One is that we can set our body clocks by getting a good dose of morning sunlight. So it doesn't really matter who we're working with, what time of the year, what temperature, we can go outside and get a dose of light in the morning. That's a really good way of setting that body clock to help those rhythms be in place.
Good to know.
Typically, most people we see have difficulties getting to sleep, so that it's like they stay awake too long. So that early morning sunlight is really important. Occasionally, particularly people we see with conditions like CP, if they've got epilepsy and treated with medications that make them sleepy, sometimes parents say, look, my child falls asleep at 4 p.m, their whole rhythms are out. So we can use sunlight in a different way. We could say, okay, how about getting a dose of sunlight later in the day to push your body clock back? So that's one point, using light as a tool and using it strategically. Equally, it's things like timing of baths and showers. We know that having a warm or tepid bath helps with that distal vasodilation. So in the hour before bedtime, if it's feasible and practical, having a shower or bath can make a real difference to that body temperature readiness for sleep.
Oh, wow.
And if we're working with someone who can't easily get in and out of a bath or shower, as is the case for many people we work with, perhaps even just, having a warm face cloth or something to wipe hands and feet.
Yeah.
Just something that's got that's enjoyable from a sensory point of view, but also practical, feasible. Parents get stressed, hot and sweaty, trying to get their child into a bath before bedtime, then it's counterproductive. But we know that shower, and then the other thing that's interesting about that is in a heat wave, our temptation would be to have a really cold shower or bath to cool us down. But in fact, we want to keep that distal vasodilation happening. So just a tepid kind of body, a warmish bath or shower will still have that same cooling effect because our skin will get damp, the air on our skin will cool us down, but we won't be kind of causing that vasoconstriction just before bedtime.
Those cold feet that plague me.
Cold, yeah. No, that's
I want to talk about that because I feel like that's the biggest complaint.
Exactly.
Cold feet.
And look, I just love the way you're just giving me all these little cues. Like another one. So that's really interesting too. And what I've realised is that we definitely do need warm extremities for sleep onset. And in winter, there's this sense, or a couple of points actually. One is when I was doing my study, often I would arrive at participants' homes just before bedtime because that's when it suited people best for me to be there to show them how to set up the equipment. And often it was the middle of winter, it was July, and our winters can be pretty cold, even though people think Australia's hot and sunny. Our winters can get very, very cold, but probably 19 out of the 22 children I saw had bare feet every night. Our little Aussie kids just don't wear shoes and socks or slippers before bed. So it's normal for them to run around and have cold feet. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I've learned is that often if you do have cold extremities, it's not enough just to go and put your socks on or put your Ugg boots on when your feet are cold. They won't actively warm your feet up.
No, because once they're cold, that's
They
seem to stay cold.
So lots of strategies there. Like people can, you can get little electric foot warmers that you can put your feet into ahead of time.
Hot water bottle
in the base of the bed before bed so it's nice and warm before you get in. Last winter, I even put my socks in the microwave so I could put warm socks on.
Nice.
That was really easy, and there was nothing kind of risky or dangerous. So again, when we're working with vulnerable populations, you can't necessarily tell us what they're feeling. We need to be aware of risks of using heating devices or cooling devices because we might not get it right. So safe options are things like, just gently heating the socks in the microwave.
That just reminds me of an episode of Seinfeld where Kramer literally puts, do you know the episode where he puts his clothes in a pizza oven before he goes to sleep?
Yeah. An alternative.
There was science behind it.
Yeah. And look, I've got a friend who tells me she puts her pillowcase in the fridge before she goes to bed. So she's got a nice cold pillow to put her head on. So look, the thing that's important about this too is, you've touched on it really already, is that there's no one size that fits all. And even for us, there's no one size that will fit us because the seasons change, the temperature changes, the time of day changes. We change with our age, our health conditions, with the activities we're doing. All of these things have an impact on our body temperature regulation and how that affects our ability to sleep and how we manage our sleep environment, our bed, our bedding, clothing, all those things make a difference. And so when we're working with people who aren't able to actively manage those, so someone who's got a severe movement impairment, communication impairment, people with sensory impairments, or even people who've got attentional difficulties who just don't notice when their hands and feet are too cold, they're all people that we could be making a real difference to when we're more tuned into all those aspects of temperature regulation, comfort, performance, and equally, even though we know that thermoregulation affects sleep, we also know it affects wakefulness and performance. It's almost in the opposite way. So there's a whole other conversation that could be had there as well.
What about ambient temperature? I think I feel like people talk a lot about ambient temperature, don't they? And kind of go, what's the ideal temperature to go to sleep in? What would you say to that?
Well, most research tells us that the ideal bedroom temperature is between 16 and 18 degrees. So for many people, that's a lot cooler than they think it should be. And I know, having spent lots of winters in the Northern Hemisphere because of family who I've stayed with, in the Northern Hemisphere, I've never been hotter than those winter nights in Northern Hemisphere.
Radiators.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So it's really
up in a sweaty mess.
And equally, I know when I've worked with parents of young children who are perhaps particularly vulnerable medically and health-wise, there's this kind of urge to keep the room warm because it feels safer somehow that way. It's hard to know completely how much difference that makes on people's sleep. Like the research tells us we need a colder environment for sleep, but equally if someone's perhaps really frail and elderly and maybe young children, neonates with health conditions, that rule might not apply. So, as always, it's not a one size fits all. But generally I find keeping the bedroom cooler is definitely the best way to go, because then you can use clothing and bedding to get body temperature to, as it should be.
Yeah, you can manipulate the other aspects of the environment
to make it more individualized and more flexible.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I just have another question. Sue, yet another question. You can tell that I really want to know more about sleep. So I feel like these are so common questions clinically, because sometimes if you've seen myself as a physio and I'm seeing my clients during the day and they want to engage in physical activity, for example, and they're hoping they'll have an impact on their sleep, you really are just highlighting the importance of 24 hours, like looking across the 24 hours.
Absolutely, definitely, yeah.
Yep.
In fact, that's probably what got me into my sleep research right from the beginning, is seeing the impact on daytime participation and participation in our therapies. There's amazing therapists who come up with wonderful programs or really important assessments and reassessments, but sometimes I've worked with children who sleep through their hydrotherapy, who sleep through, we'll do a seating assessment and the child's asleep through the whole thing, changes in their posture. I hear about parents who say, look, it's taking me an hour for my child to swallow 1 teaspoon of food, and yet when they've had a good night's sleep, they can eat a whole plate full in 10 minutes. So massive impact of sleep on all aspects of daytime function, but also the massive impact of daytime function on sleep. So it is that whole, as I said before, it's like a symphony. Everything works together, but it's got to be really well synchronized. There's that whole, the rhythms of day and night, of activities, of environments, they are what really make a difference.
And I think you've covered so many beautiful practical components that we can look at for everyone. In terms of assessments, just as the final sort of question, I suppose, about assessments, and I know you had a range of assessments here, what would you recommend that clinicians could use in the home setting now if they are identifying this is a bit of an issue?
Yeah, my thoughts keep changing on that, actually, because it can be quite complicated, but we don't want life to be complicated, particularly in the home setting. And we're also conscious of how we use people's time. And also there's more and more devices coming out, almost feels like daily, new wearable devices that don't just measure, heart rate or steps or heart rate variability, but also measure skin temperature and core body temperature. So a range of devices. For my research, I use the little thermocron eye buttons that look like just a little battery. They
do.
Yeah. But the thing about these is I have found them useful as a clinician. So when I've worked with people where we really don't know whether a certain kind of bed or mattress is making a person too hot or too cold, I can put these devices on the person's skin and measure changes in their skin temperature, or I can actually put them on the mattress surface or on the end of the bed to record ambient bedroom temperature as well. So they're really good devices, and they just go on the skin using Fixamol. Obviously not safe for children who might be likely to pick at or swallow,
put them,
or if they've got allergies to skin tape. But for the participants that I work with, of all ages from 6 through to 18, all ranges of levels of gym, FCS levels, etc., the people we work with, these were really safe and practical and comfortable. You forget you've got them on. So if clinicians really, really were wanting to get right into thermoregulation and measure ambient temperature in the bedroom, the bed, on the body, then these thermocron eye buttons might be useful.
Yeah,
but they cost money and they take time.
Yeah.
Equally, just observation. If parents, know their child, lots of observation can make a difference, but that can be confusing too.
Yes.
Your child might get red and sweaty when they're too hot, but another little child with CP might actually just get pale and cold and clammy when they're too hot. So it's very hard sometimes to measure that. But even just simple things like in the mainstream now, a lot of baby monitors have room temperature measures. So just keeping an eye on what the bedroom temperature is and noticing if it's actually 27 degrees because you've got a bedroom window that's facing west at night time.
Yeah.
Things like that are really practical, can make a big difference.
And I love that they don't have to be in a clinical environment, and I think that's the strength of this study. It just highlights what we can do really practically and make a big impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What has to be in the home setting, because that's all those factors of the home setting are what make the difference. So
Yes.
if the measures aren't being taken in the home setting, then they're not relevant.
And I saw that as a real strength of your study, is that a lot of the evidence prior to that was, laboratory based or hospital based, and that's just not real life, is it?
Not for our purposes. When
No.
what we're wanting to do is work out how we can make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Sue, that was absolutely spectacular. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us. I feel like we learned even more just from this conversation, let alone from reading the paper.
Absolutely.
We are now going to do the Tell It to Ed.
Yay.
Now, Ed is a lovely producer who puts everything together for us and does all the practicalities. Ed doesn't necessarily have a background in child health or research.
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay, well, the whole idea of this segment is that we want to be able to describe to Ed what it is that this study and what this research actually means. And he'll also have an opportunity for some questions as well.
Nice.
All right, Sue, take it away to Tell It to Ed.
Okay, Ed. Well, my study was really underpinned by the fact that we know that sleep is massively, hugely important for everybody, and particularly the population we work with, children with conditions such as cerebral palsy. They are more vulnerable to having sleep difficulties. They massively need to have good sleep, though, because the challenges of daytime, of participating in therapy, just getting through their days can be huge. So it's this kind of double whammy of often more vulnerable to sleep problems, but really, really needing a good night's sleep just to get on with life and day-to-day stuff. So my focus on my study was looking at thermoregulation during sleep in children with neurological conditions like cerebral palsy. And it's really important to point out that, in fact, thermoregulation was just one of, I could have chosen maybe 16 different topics to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Sensory responses, management of pain, management of movement, breathing, impact of light on sleep. There's so many different things that have a big impact on how children sleep. I had to choose one. And because the temperature was quite a mystery to me, and in fact a mystery really when you look at all the research that's out there, that's why I kind of focused on temperature. So temperature during sleep is important, makes a big difference, but it is one of many, many factors that make a difference.
Thank you. Well, Ed, do you have any questions for the doctor?
Yeah, look, I do. I found that incredibly interesting. There's a lot about the human body that I don't know, but to learn how sleep is regulated and how you can sleep better, that really intrigues me because I've actually been in the market to buy a bed for the best part of like 15 years now.
Oh, wow.
So I'm just too cheap to buy something. But I would love to know, like, what should I be looking for? You're saying you have these little battery type things that, can I take them with me to like a bed shop and try the bed? Or
Yeah. Well, they probably wouldn't be particularly useful because they're not really useful in real time. So that's number one.
Okay.
But in terms of looking for a bed, it is really, really challenging. And I learnt the hard way that I remember going shopping for a bed when I was, at the end of the day, I was really tired and achy. We went into a shop, went with my husband, we lay on the bed and I went, oh my God, this is amazing. We've got to have this one. And ended up buying quite an expensive bed that felt just soft and beautiful and comfortable. And I've hated it ever since. It was completely wrong.
no.
Really
Sue.
big disaster. And the irony of everyone keeps going, oh my God, Sue, you're meant to be, Dr. Sleep and you've stuffed up big time buying your own bed and mattress. So it is really hard. If you can, there are definitely bedding mattress suppliers and companies that will allow you to choose a mattress and actually trial it for 30 or even 100 days and change it if you decide it doesn't quite suit you.
Wow, that's
incredible.
great.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, you've got to read
Really
between
feels
the
real.
read the fine print. So some of the companies say, but you need to pay the $400 transportation to send it forwards and back. You need to have paid for a really good quality mattress protector so it comes back in pristine condition. We're not actually going to give you your money back. We're just going to give you the opportunity to try a different type of mattress. So it's not that simple, but it still is a really nice option to think about, knowing that it – and I feel like most people would know that what feels like the right kind of bed when you're wide awake on a Sunday afternoon wandering through a shopping centre is different to what you're going to feel when you've had a whole week or a whole month of sleeping in the bed night after night after night. And so it really is really hard to make a choice. Having said that, generally it seems that, especially if you've got postural, if you need good postural support to help keep your body, in a good position, choosing a mattress that lets you sink right in might feel really comfortable, but in the longer term, it doesn't support your posture and your body's shape well. Also, when you sink in, you're more likely to get very hot during sleep because your body's kind of encompassed by that surface. So often a good thing that works is to get a mattress that's quite firm and supports your body really well, but perhaps with a softer comfort layer on the top so that there is that comfort layer of softness that your body can feel, but at the same time you're getting good postural support. There are so many beds out there. In the mainstream now, there's adjustable beds where you can raise the head and the legs of your bed if you need to, and that's not confined to people with health conditions. Some people love being able to change that as well.
That is fabulous. Well, thank you very, very much to both Ed for asking such a great question, which is
Ed.
very practical.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Sue. And I think you would all agree that this is a very informative session.
Yes. And come wintertime, we'll all be putting our socks in the microwave.
We will be. I love it.
That's not very scientific.
That's my take-home message.
Now, as per usual, we said last week as well, the run sheet notes for all of our podcasts will be available on our website, researchworks.net. And of course, if you want to record this as part of your CPD, there's a form you can fill out with some reflection notes as well, where you can use that as part of your evidence. Next week, we will be discussing the article, State of the Evidence Traffic Lights 2019, the systematic review of the interventions for preventing and treating children with cerebral palsy. We are very excited. As you can see, excited is probably one of my favorite words, but we're very excited to have...
And privileged.
And privileged. I think, we say that a lot. To have Professor Iona Novak here with us. She's from the CP Alliance Research Institute and the University of Sydney. And she is going to give so many bits of information that I think we can really practically look at as clinicians, because the work they did for this systematic review is insane.
It's incredible. It's humongous. I can't even begin to describe the breadth of it.
Nor can I.
Yeah.
So it will be great, exciting and privileging.
And practical.
To speak with her. So please do join us for that. Thank you so much for your time and have a great week.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.